From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled-release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
As drug overdoses surge to record high in the United States, we look at how the Sackler-owned Purdue Pharma and other drug companies fueled the opioid epidemic. We'll speak to the Oscar-winning filmmaker Alex Gibney about his new two-part HBO series, The Crime of the Century. Then the remains of 9 indigenous children are buried by the Rosebud Sioux in South Dakota after being transferred from the former Carlisle Indian Residential School in Pennsylvania, where the children were sent over 100 years ago after being ripped from their families.
Remember me when the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free.
We'll speak to members of the Rosebud Sioux who helped to return the remains of the children. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 4 people, 3 of them athletes from the South African soccer team, have tested positive for COVID-19 in Tokyo's Olympic Village ahead of the kickoff of the Summer Olympics later this week. Meanwhile, one of tennis's biggest rising stars, 17-year-old American Coco Gauff, had to bow out of the competition after contracting COVID-19. Japanese officials announced earlier today an unnamed American gymnast has also tested positive for COVID. No spectators will be allowed at the Olympics in Tokyo, where there's very low public support for the event. In Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson went into self-isolation over the week after coming into contact with UK Health Secretary Sajid Javid, who tested positive for COVID-19. Johnson delivered a message to the British people from isolation Sunday, one day before the UK lifted its coronavirus restrictions.
If we don't do it now, we've got to ask ourselves, when will we ever do it? So this is the right moment, but we've got to do it cautiously. We've got to remember that this virus is sadly still out there. Cases are rising. We can see the extreme contagiousness of the Delta variant.
In France, over 100,000 people took to the streets Saturday, many spurred by right-wing politicians to condemn President Macron's plan for mandatory vaccines for healthcare workers and a health pass to gain entry to bars, restaurants, and cinemas. 2 vaccination centers were also vandalized in France over the weekend. Meanwhile, the highly contagious Delta coronavirus variant is continuing its rapid spread across the globe, with poor, mostly unvaccinated countries bearing the brunt of its impact. Namibia is recording a world record of 28 COVID-19 deaths per 1 million people as infections soar across many African nations. The World Health Organization is also warning cases are surging in Latin America and the Caribbean as the Delta variant becomes dominant across the region. Here in the United States, Centers for Disease Control Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said COVID-19 is, quote, becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated as cases continue to rise in all 50 states, driven by the Delta variant, with the most dramatic increases in areas with low vaccination rates. 20% of new cases are being reported in Florida alone. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy said vaccine refusal puts children under 12 who are not able to get the vaccine at risk.
Our kids depend on us, the people around them, being protected, being vaccinated in order to shield them from the virus. And that's why, again, it's so important for us to get vaccinated. I'm worried that what we're starting to see increasingly in states like Arkansas and Missouri and Nevada and my home state of Florida and Louisiana, these surges within the unvaccinated population.
Dr. Murthy also says he expects more localities throughout the U.S. to reimpose mask mandates and other mitigation measures, as L.A. recently did, as numbers continue to rise. Dr. Walensky said 99.5% of those dying of COVID-19 are unvaccinated in the United States. Meanwhile, at least 5 Texas Democrats who fled to Washington, D.C. last week to block their state from passing sweeping voter restrictions tested positive for COVID-19. The legislators were fully vaccinated. A federal judge in Texas ruled Friday that DACA, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is unlawful, in a crushing blow to immigrant communities and activists. The order does not affect current recipients for now, but blocks the Department of Homeland Security from approving any new applications. DACA's offered temporary legal protections and work authorization for over 800,000 undocumented people who were brought to the U.S. as children. Judge Andrew Hannon said the program exceeded President Obama's authority when he created it through executive action in 2012. President Biden vowed his Justice Department would appeal the ruling. Biden and other Democrats renewed calls for Congress to pass legislation providing a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who've spent almost their entire lives in the United States. A joint investigation by 17 news outlets, including The Guardian and The Washington Post, found Israeli surveillance company NSO Group targeted the phones of journalists, activists, and political figures around the world for foreign governments using their Pegasus software. A massive data leak shared with the publications by Amnesty International and Forbidden Stories, a Paris-based nonprofit, contained over 50,000 phone numbers gathered since 2016, which reportedly includes heads of state. It's unclear how many phones were actually breached. The report has identified 37 hacks out of 67 smartphones that were analyzed. The Washington Post said the cell phone of the fiancé of its slain colonist, Jamal Khashoggi, was infected with the malware days after his murder, October 2018, at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. In climate news, the death toll from the catastrophic floods that have torn through parts of Western Europe continues to rise. At least 157 people have been confirmed dead in Germany, while 31 fatalities are being reported in Belgium. Rescue efforts are ongoing as hundreds of people remain missing. This is the heaviest rainfall many European countries have seen in at least a century. This comes as climate change-fueled wildfires continue to rage across the western United States. In Oregon, firefighters battling the massive bootleg fire were forced to retreat from portions of the fire line last week as high winds and dry conditions are fueling the blaze's growth. As of Sunday, the bootleg fire had burned nearly 300,000 acres. More than 70 major fires are burning in the western United States. Martine Moïse, the widow of assassinated President Jovenel Moïse, has returned to Haiti after being treated at a Miami hospital for injuries sustained in the attack at the presidential residence. Colombian authorities said Friday a former Haitian Justice Ministry official, Joseph Félix Badiou, may have ordered Moïse's killing. Few other details are known, including his whereabouts. In occupied East Jerusalem, Israeli police violently attacked and forcibly removed worshippers from the Al-Aqsa Mosque Sunday, just 2 days ahead of Eid al-Adha, and as Israeli forces continue their attacks in the occupied territories. This is Sheikh Omar Al-Kiswani, the director of the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
It is clearly provocative action. At dawn, Israeli forces evacuated worshippers by force, and more than 1,300 extremists visited and prayed and did provocative tours. The occupation forces raided Al-Aqsa compound and attacked worshippers who are in there until now.
Prominent Egyptian human rights activist Esra Abdel Fattah has been released from prison. She had been behind bars since October 2019, part of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's brutal crackdown on dissent. Esra Abdel Fattah played a leading role in the 2011 uprising, which helped topple the dictator Hosni Mubarak. The first Guantanamo Bay prisoner to be released under the Biden administration has returned to his home country of Morocco. 56-year-old Abdulatif Nasser was imprisoned for nearly 2 decades without charge, had been cleared for release since 2016. 39 prisoners remain at Guantanamo. In Afghanistan, some 12,000 families have been displaced and are in need of immediate assistance amidst deadly fighting between Afghan forces and the Taliban. This is a displaced woman speaking from Takhar province.
We have not come here eagerly. 10 women and 10 men are here together, while we had our own village and house before. What else can we do? Our children and ourselves are sick, and we have no carpets or anything else here.
Intra-Afghan talks have resumed in Doha as the U.S. and NATO withdrawal nears completion. In other news from Afghanistan, Pulitzer Prize-winning Indian photojournalist Danish Siddiqui was killed while covering a clash between Afghan security forces and the Taliban Friday. Siddiqui, a staff journalist at Reuters since 2010, was embedded with members of Afghanistan's elite special forces attempting to recover a district near the border with Pakistan. Siddiqui is the first known journalist killed in Afghanistan since U.S. and allied troops began their withdrawal. He was just 38 years old and is survived by his wife and 2 children. In Washington, D.C., at least 3 people were injured in a shooting outside Nationals Park Saturday night during a baseball game between the Washington Nationals and San Diego Padres. Multiple loud gunshots were heard, causing panicked fans inside the stadium to flee and seek shelter. Gun violence erupted elsewhere across the country over the weekend, including Washington, D.C., and other parts in Chicago, where 8 people were reported dead and some 50 others injured in shootings since Friday night. Other fatal shootings were also recorded in Philadelphia and Tucson. Illinois has become the first U.S. state to ban law enforcement from lying and using other deceptive methods when interrogating minors. The ban goes into effect in January. It will prohibit law enforcement agents from falsely promising leniency or claiming to have incriminating evidence when they don't. These methods are still largely allowed in the United States, often leading to false confessions with children and people with intellectual disabilities, particularly vulnerable. The remains of 9 indigenous children were buried Saturday by the Rosebud Sioux in South Dakota after being transferred back from the former Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. On Friday, another ceremony was held at a Missouri River landing near Sioux City, Iowa, where the children departed their homes, ripped from their families over a century ago, as part of the cultural genocide orchestrated by the U.S. government. We'll have more on this later in the broadcast with Christopher Eagle Bear. In Kansas, hundreds of workers at the Frito-Lay factory in Topeka have been on strike for 2 weeks to demand fair pay and humane working conditions. Workers say they're forced to work 12-hour days, including over the weekend. Many have not received a pay raise in years. In the summer, workers endure triple-digit temperatures without air conditioning. Multiple workers have reportedly died on the job of heart attacks. Senator Bernie Sanders voiced support for the strikers over the weekend, noting Frito-Lay made over $4.2 billion in sales last year. And the civil rights pioneer, Gloria Richardson, died over the weekend at the age of 99. Richardson was co-founder of the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee in Maryland, which fought to desegregate public institutions like schools and hospitals. Richardson also spent much of her life fighting for economic justice. She described herself as a radical, a revolutionary, and was one of the few women at the forefront of protests during the civil rights movement. In 2013, Democracy Now! Spoke with her about her life's work, including the very brief moment she took the microphone during the 1963 March on Washington.
So I went up, so I said, hold on, I really, by that time, was so annoyed, I was going to tell them, you all just sit here until they pass that civil rights bill, even if it is a weak one. And I said, hello. So I guess they were right.
And because they pulled the mic from you.
Oh, yeah, they pulled it, but they had one of the marshals.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, as drug overdoses surge to a record high in the United States, we look at how the Sackler-owned Purdue Pharma and other drug companies fueled the opioid epidemic. We'll speak to the Oscar-winning filmmaker Alex Gibney about his two-part HBO series, The Crime of the Century. Stay with us.
Till the break of dawn. When you buy food cheap, you need a coupon to catch a sale retail before it gets stale. So hurry up and get the wick, check out the mail and shop non-stop. By how I hip hop on the mic and make it cooperate with the rhythm. That is what I give them. Reagan is depressed, but I voted for Shirley Chisholm. It might sound confusing, the style that I'm using, but in the end, I'm sure that you will find it quite amusing and funny. Oh honey, it's just ridiculous. Don't try to front. Come on and admit you was thrilled, chill. Your heart was fulfilled, so respect the architect as I begin to build. Science and my reliance is a form of rap. Like Carl Lewis, I get to it. So let's go to lap. Go to lap. Nobody beats the biz. Nobody beats the biz. Nobody beats the biz. Nobody beats the biz.
Nobody Beats the Biz by the late, great Biz Markie, one of hip-hop's true original voices. Biz Markie passed away Friday at the age of 57. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says U.S. drug overdose deaths skyrocketed to a recent 93,000 last year, a nearly 30% increase. That's the largest one-year increase ever recorded. Overdoses rose in 48 of 50 states. Opioid overdoses accounted for nearly two-thirds of the deaths, driven in part by synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than heroin. Overall, drug overdoses accounted for more deaths in 2020 than car crashes, gun violence, and HIV/AIDS combined. This comes as the nation continues to deal with the fallout from the devastating opioid epidemic that has killed over 500,000 people in the United States since 1999. 15 states recently agreed to abandon their fight to block the bankruptcy plan of Purdue Pharma, the maker of the highly addictive OxyContin. In exchange, Purdue will release tens of millions of documents and pay a settlement expected to reach $4.5 billion. The owners of Purdue, the Sackler family, will agree to cede ownership of Purdue, but will not have to admit responsibility for their role in fueling the opioid epidemic. They'll also be shielded from future opioid lawsuits. Meanwhile, closing arguments will be held next week in a closely watched federal trial in West Virginia against the nation's three largest drug distributors. We turn now to a stunning two-part documentary directed by Alex Gibney about Big Pharma's role in driving the opioid crisis. It's called The Crime of the Century.
I came out of the doctors, and there was a representative of Purdue. She said, we have a drug called OxyContin. We pick up all the costs. Just take as much as you need. I said, sounds like a deal.
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled-release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
When we talk about drugs like oxycodone, you're talking about drugs that are essentially heroin pills. Opioid makers started to promote their opioids for common chronic pain conditions.
Purdue didn't have any evidence that the drug was safe, so the company obtained the help of a medical officer at FDA.
This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal.
Hundreds and hundreds of sales reps go out and meet with doctors and say, the FDA approved this.
Big Pharma celebrated its marketing muscle, using parties to lure doctors to write scripts.
This was a new drug cartel. There were drug dealers wearing suits and lab coats.
Basically, here's some money, write some scripts.
Yes, I'm looking at this and I'm going, clearly we're breaking the law.
Purdue ends up getting pursued by the authorities. The company lied under oath.
Ethics did not play a role.
The companies took out their checkbooks and paid to keep the evidence hidden.
You are basically telling pharmaceutical companies you have a green light to do this.
It explains how America got hooked on opioids.
Doctors willing to be paid to prescribe the drug, those are the people that are going to get you promoted and eventually put you in prison.
The abuse exploded and spread like cancer.
When you're in that much pain and you're addicted to such a high dose, you're a trap rat.
When the companies didn't like that they were being held accountable, they decided to change the statute.
They should be changing their behaviors, not the rules.
People were dying by the tens of thousands, and their own representatives are basically selling them down the river.
If you talk to people whose lives have been touched, what does matter to a lot of these people is truth.
That's the trailer for Crime of the Century, a two-part documentary available on HBO and HBO Max. The series is directed by the Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker Alex Gibney, who joins us now. His other films include Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, Going Clear, Scientology, and The Prison of Belief, and the Oscar-winning Taxi to the Dark Side. Alex Gibney joins us from Summit, New Jersey. Alex, welcome back to Democracy Now! This is a powerful, explosive documentary that describes the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, as a kind of crime syndicate. Can you go back and talk about first why you got interested in this and then lay out the crime of the century?
So, Amy, I think this started for me when I had a discussion with a group of investigative journalists at the Washington Post who collaborated with me on this project, as well as some other journalists. And they sketched out the scope of this opioid crisis over the course of 20 years. And as they talked to me, I realized that the big problem here was that we had been seeing it as a crisis, like a natural disaster, like a flood or a hurricane, rather than as a series of crimes. And the crimes really coalesce around the idea of fraud. And it was Purdue Pharma that really launched that fraud with a drug called OxyContin, which is time-release oxycodone, which is a terribly potent opioid. And what they did initially was to gain approval by the FDA. And they worked with a man named Curtis Wright, who was at the FDA, and essentially worked with him to write the review of their own application. And they got inserted into the package insert, the paper that comes along with the prescription, basically two notes. One, that it wasn't terribly addictive, and two, because of the time-release mechanism, the Contin system, it wasn't prone to abuse. Neither of those things were true, but their salesmen then used those pieces of information to aggressively mount a campaign for greater and greater use of the drug. I mean, this is a powerful and very useful drug for people with end-of-life cancer pain, for example. But they wanted to expand the market rather dramatically so that it, as the Purdue salespeople would say, it's the one to start with and the one to stay with. And so that you might be prescribed it for knee pain if you were a high school athlete, that kind of thing. And that's how the opioid crisis really started, with fraud. and it spread from there.
And tell us who the Sacklers are and who the men were in the family who began this and understood it's essential not only to produce the drug, but to sell it, and the kind of scheme that they developed to include drugstores, doctors, and on.
Well, the Sacklers were really, the key Sacklers were three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond. And at some point in time, they all found themselves at the Creedmoor Psychiatric Facility, and they were actually rather appalled at some of the procedures they were forced to do, orbital lobotomies and electroshock therapy. And they thought, well, wouldn't it be better if we could find a pharmacological solution to some of these maladies? And so that was where this started, with a sense of idealism. But it quickly turned. Arthur Sackler, the eldest brother, developed at an advertising firm named McAdams, a mechanism of selling drugs like you would sell soap, and he became famous for pushing Librium and Valium. And again, kind of it was the model for what would become the selling mechanism for OxyContin. Pitch directly to doctors, sometimes remunerate them for being your pitch person, and you use all sorts of Madison Avenue techniques to really pump up the volume. Now, Arthur died before the introduction of OxyContin, but Mortimer and Raymond, established Purdue, Frederick, and Purdue Pharma, two companies that would make and market OxyContin. Raymond's son, Richard Sackler, is the guy who's most associated with OxyContin, and he was the guy who developed a strategy to pitch directly to doctors, sometimes hiring doctors for speakers programs, which would effectively cause them to take money to prescribe more and more OxyContin, and also promote the use of OxyContin to doctors all over the country, and to kind of convince them that people who took it wouldn't be at risk of addiction, and that it couldn't be easily abused. And they came up with a term called, or they became famous for really pushing a term called pseudo-addiction, which is to say that you can't really be addicted to OxyContin, no matter how high up the scale you go in terms of the volume. That's pseudo-addiction, because it really is just, it's the pain you're suffering from, not the need for the drug. All of these things were false, and they knew that to some extent their business model depended on bad doctors, pill mills, which were, sometimes pharmacies and sometimes doctors purposefully misprescribing this drug because it held within it, once you could crush it, it held within it such powerful opioid material that you could just then dissolve it into water and either shoot it, or you could just crush it and snort it. As Andrew Kolodny says in the trailer, they were like heroin pills.
Let me go to a video testimony of Dr. Richard Sackler. This is from 2019. The investigative news organization ProPublica published it. Dr. Richard Sackler of Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, a part of the deposition he gave in 2015 lawsuit in Kentucky. The company waged a 3-year legal battle to keep this video secret. Sackler was questioned by attorney Tyler Thompson.
Sitting here today, after all you've come to learn as a witness, do you believe Purdue's conduct in marketing and promoting OxyContin in Kentucky caused any of the prescription drug addiction problems now plaguing the Commonwealth?
I don't believe so.
Sitting here today, after all you've come to learn as a witness, do you believe that Purdue's conduct in Kentucky has led to an excessive or unnecessary amount of opioids being located throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky?
I don't believe so.
Do you believe that any of Purdue's conduct has led to an increase in people being addicted in the Commonwealth of Kentucky?
No.
The significance of this, Alex Gibney, and how rarely we hear the voices of the Sacklers.
That is true, and it was a great thing that ProPublica did, and actually we worked with ProPublica to further release more of that deposition in the documentary. But what's staggering about that exchange is that you see that Richard Sackler doesn't evince any sense of sorrow or responsibility at all for the opioid crisis, when it's quite clear. And don't just take my word for it, but there were federal investigations into Purdue. It's quite clear that they bear an enormous responsibility for the deaths that we see, and well over 500,000 people. And the idea that he could simply brush off any sense of responsibility at all is kind of staggering. But then, you know, you see that often with people who allow themselves to rationalize their behavior. A professor of mine once said, economic actors aren't rational, they're rationalizers. I think that goes in spades for Richard Sackler.
So I want to go again back to your documentary, The Crime of the Century. This features Insys salesman Alec Burlakoff talking about the 4 categories of doctors.
There's 4 categories. It's blue, yellow, green, red. Blue is analytical. That means if you don't have a scientific, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with a lot of patients that proves your data is right, you're not getting a sale. What does that mean to me? It means I don't call on analytical doctors because I don't have any studies like that. Then you have your yellow, that's your amiable doctor. They want to be friends with everybody. They want everybody to love them, which means if you're selling a drug and there's 5 other competitors, they just go in a rotation. This one gets Subsys, this one gets Lozanda, this one gets Abstral, and then we go back around. Guess what? They're out because they're just sharing the wealth. So now you got your green, which is kind of like your earthy type of doctor. Like, God forbid you do a lunch and not recycle, you'll never go back there again. But then you got your reds. Reds are your businessmen. They own their practice, they run their practice, they manage their books, they see a crazy number of patients. It's all about efficiency. In fact, when you as the rep walk in there, they run to you with a pen to sign, and they're running away at the same time because they don't have time to talk with you because they're treating patients making money. And if he's a red and he's a businessman, I gotta show him the WIFM. What is the WIFM? W-I-F-M. What's in it for me? That's all they're thinking. What's in it for me? Buddy, will you stop talking about the freaking drug? Will you stop talking about saving the patient? Will you stop talking about the science? And will you please tell me what's in it for me, because you're wasting my time? Those are the reds. Those are the doctors you want to find. And those are the doctors you want to move in, live, eat, and breathe with.
Perhaps the best argument for Medicare for all I've seen. But
100%.
Alex Gibney, if you can talk about who Alec Burlakoff is, what Insys is, you know, you start with Purdue Pharma, the prototype of all of this, and expand to other drug companies.
Well, Insys is a company that was selling a product called Subsys, which was a spray where you would spray fentanyl in small quantities underneath your tongue, and it would help to alleviate pain. But Alec Burlakoff was a salesman. Actually, he was rather high up at Insys in terms of sales. And they're using the playbook that Purdue kind of initiated, but taking it to a great extreme, so that it's all about the money, and it's all about trying to find either corrupt, money-hungry, or other, doctors who that becomes your business model, to look to those people to compensate them for being speakers to promote your drug. But really, when it came to Insys, they actually had a return on investment flow chart, so that if you got $40,000 from Insys as a speaker, you had to prescribe at least 2 times that amount, or they'd cut you off.
And explain, as a speaker, that you put air quotes around.
In other words, it's legal to pay doctors to speak on behalf of your drug, but in this case, so in other words, to go out and talk to other doctors about how great this drug is. The problem was that they weren't really speaking. I mean, they would just pay them money and they would go and have a dinner and maybe they'd talk to a couple of people. But it was really a quid pro quo. It was just a bribe. We'll give you $40,000 provided you prescribe $80,000 of Insys. And they would encourage them also to up the dose, to titrate up. Because the more you increase the dose, the more money that Insys is making. I mean, it's just you see in Alec Burlikoff exactly the argument for Medicare for all, because you have these terrible incentives where the incentive is not to cure the patient. The incentive is to just make as much money as possible. And I can't recall there was anything in the Hippocratic Oath that had anything to do with supply and demand. But by the time you get to Insys, riffing on the Purdue formula, it's all about the money.
So I want to go to another clip from the crime of the century. This is Gary Blinn talking about how he was given 50 OxyContin pills a day.
It was a trial from Purdue, excuse me. It was, they were testing it. They started me with maybe 8 or 10 twice a day. 160s, the highest dose. And that wasn't working, so then he just kept on raising it. 12 2 times a day, and then 15. I wasn't doing it, so we went up to 20. And I said, this still isn't doing it. So he made the phone call. He told me it was to the doctors at Purdue. And they said, give him more. So that's when we got up to the 25, twice a day, 50 pills a day. It would almost take me 15 minutes just to eat them all. It was like sitting down to a bowl of Cheerios, I was starting to feel a little toxic, like my body was telling me that we're not doing well. But I mean, what can I do but take more? You know what I'm saying? I mean, when you're in that much pain and you're addicted to that such a high dose, no matter what it is, I mean, you're a trap rat.
That's Gary Blinn talking about how he was given, 50 pills of OxyContin a day. Alex Gibney's two-part documentary, The Crime of the Century, he's interviewed in. So, Alex, explain why he was chosen. What was special about him?
Well, that he had such a high tolerance for the medication. I mean, it was not only 50 pills a day, it was 50 160 milligram tablets a day. Most people would be dead from that dose. But he had been a former heroin addict. He had a very high tolerance. And he was approached by a Purdue salesperson who said, hey, we can give you some free samples. Wouldn't that be great? I know you've got back pain. And he said, sure. And so they gave him free samples. As it turned out, the Purdue sales rep was also, had a sexual relationship with the doctor who was prescribing these pills and was prescribing them without even examining the patient. But what Purdue did what this sales rep did with Gary Blinn was to use him as a marketing tool to go to other doctors and say, look, this guy's taking 50, 160 milligram tablets a day. It just shows you no dose is too high. Titrate up, keep prescribing more and more. Now, you may be asking, okay, surely when Purdue discovered the behavior of this sales rep, she must have been viewed as a bad apple and harshly punished. To the contrary, she was promoted to a position in sales training. So it gives you some idea about just how aggressively and how fraudulently Purdue was marketing its drug.
How does this connect to the 93,000 people who died in 2020 alone of opioid addiction?
We have to be careful here and say that it doesn't necessarily connect directly, but there is a trace, there is a trail. And part of what happens here is that Purdue and other companies, by overprescribing OxyContin and also allowing for massive abuse, created an enormous demand. And for some of those people, when they either couldn't afford the drugs, insurance wouldn't pay for them anymore, or when prescribing tendencies changed, they had a real problem. So they sought out a substitute, which was heroin, And when that became too expensive, they sought out a new drug called fentanyl. And fentanyl is, as you pointed out earlier, is an extremely potent drug, 50 times more powerful than heroin. And one character in our film goes through that process, a guy named Caleb Lanier from Texas. And he ended up becoming a fentanyl dealer because he could pay for his own habit by selling it. But fentanyl is an extraordinarily dangerous drug because it's very difficult to monitor the dosage. You don't know really how much you're getting. And so fentanyl began to be imported first from China, sometimes just by mail. There would be websites in China that would say, hey, America, you want some fentanyl? Here it is. And it would come in, they'd sell it. Now a lot of it comes up from Mexico, and we look at a task force in the film that's trying to stanch that. So I think you have to see the 90,000 dead in the past year as a kind of legacy of this enormous demand that was created initially by the pharmaceutical firms. And of course, you have companies like Insys who are also overprescribing, a drug like fentanyl, as a technical matter. Now, Insys is one of the very few companies that was successfully prosecuted and a number of their executives sent to jail. But that gives you some sense of the three-part structure of this crime, and also the blurry line between illicit pharmaceutical sales and essentially cartel sales. They're not so very different.
In December, members of the Sackler family refused to apologize when House lawmakers grilled them over their role in fueling the opioid epidemic. This is Massachusetts Congressmember Ayanna Pressley addressing David Sackler.
We do not need another failed war on drugs. What we need is a reckoning and accountability for drug companies who put profits over people and rob us of lives and freedom of our loved ones. You have created a nationwide epidemic. 450,000 people have died. Let me be clear. People struggling with addiction are not criminals. Your family and Purdue Pharma, you are the criminals. You are the ones who disregard your duties to society, and you should be ashamed of yourselves.
So, Alex Gibney, in fact, while you talk about Insys, people there were jailed. The Sackler family, and this goes to the recently settled lawsuit, and I'm wondering if you could comment on this. 15 states recently abandoning their fight to block the bankruptcy plan of Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. In exchange, Purdue releasing tens of millions of documents, paying a settlement expected to reach $4.5 billion. But the Sackler family agreeing to cede ownership of Purdue, but will not have to admit responsibility.
Yeah, it's really, that settlement was designed to sound good, like, oh my gosh, $4.5 billion is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But the Sacklers have about $11 billion. And that $4.5 billion gets paid over 9 years. So if you're taking in at least 5% on your money, it's really not affecting the principal at all. But I think the larger thing here goes to a failure of accountability. Purdue was investigated by the federal government back in 2006, and indeed found guilty. That investigation, which was a very robust investigation, really laid out the roadmap for how Purdue did what it did, and the attorneys were arguing for very extensive felony convictions. Ultimately, Purdue used its muscle to go above those attorneys and have the charges knocked way back to misdemeanors and a fine. And most importantly, and this gets to the current episode, they were able to seal all the records relating to the prosecution. So the most important evidence was buried, which meant that all of us, the public, couldn't see what had really happened in order to be able to stop it. The one bit of good news in this settlement, and there's not much good news in it because they're not really being held financially accountable or criminally accountable, but the one bit of good news is that a huge treasure trove of documents will be released. And so at least to prevent the next episode from happening again. We can study those documents and see exactly how it was that Purdue did what it did.
And people shouldn't forget that the Sacklers sponsor so much of the arts, not only in New York, where we are, but around the country. You have Sackler galleries at all the major art installations, which now are deciding what to do about this.
That's correct. But, one thing I would like to point out, as much as we talk about the Sacklers, and it's very important to talk about them and Purdue, we shouldn't be naive and think that that was the only company that was making extraordinary profits out of the opioid crisis, and indeed didn't know better. I mean, our three huge companies, which are distributors of drugs, Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen, and McKesson, they knew very well that their opioid pills were being diverted in ways that were causing massive addiction, but they didn't do anything about it. And indeed, they ended up influencing Congress to pass a law which made them even less accountable because they used the power of the revolving door to rig the rules. Johnson & Johnson, famous for baby shampoo, was one of the biggest manufacturers of a potent kind of opioid produced in Tasmania that actually, supplied Purdue Pharma with all of the oxycodone that they needed in order to be able to market their drug. They wouldn't have been able to do it without Johnson & Johnson. So there is a pretty big and robust.
And they paid a settlement, Johnson & Johnson, of $230 million over its role in fueling the opioid crisis.
Yes, they did.
But, of course, with all these companies, we're talking about profits of billions.
That's correct. And also, in many cases, we're talking about bearing the evidence. In other words, the deal is almost always, and this is something we've got to look at as a country, the deal is almost always, we'll pay a fine, we won't admit responsibility, and most important of all, the evidence will never be seen.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us, Alex. Alex Gibney, Oscar-winning filmmaker. His latest film, the two-part HBO documentary titled The Crime of the Century, which traces the origins of the opioid epidemic and those who enabled it. Next up, the remains of 9 indigenous children were buried Saturday by the Rosebud Sioux in South Dakota after being transferred back from the former Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where the children were sent over a century ago after being ripped from their families. We'll speak with Christopher Eaglebear from a Native American Youth Council that helped bring them home. Stay with him.
Where to go? Love and hatred fill my being, torn in this world of woe. What happened to the love we knew and the way we cared back then? Prophecies are coming true, but this will not be the end. Oh no, this won't be the end. And in our darkest hour, we will not be afraid.
Sichangu, this is We Will Rise Up by Joanne Shenandoah. Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. In 1879, the first indigenous children, sons and daughters of Rosebud Sioux chiefs, arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School they were forced to attend in Pennsylvania. This weekend, some of them returned home after they were ripped from their families more than a century ago. Carlisle was the first government boarding school run that was off of reservation land, and it set the standard for other schools with its motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The schools were known for their brutal assimilation practices, forcing students to change their clothing, language, and culture. More than 10,000 children were taken to the Carlisle school before it closed in 1918. Many of the kids died and were buried in a cemetery on site instead of being returned to their parents. In the past week, 10 of them, their remains, were returned home. One was returned to the Alaskan Aleut tribe. The other 9 were returned to representatives of the Rosebud Sioux tribe of South Dakota. 5 of them were among the first students brought to Carlisle. On Wednesday, Interior Department Secretary Deborah Haaland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo and whose great-grandfather was sent to Carlisle, spoke at a ceremony at the Carlisle Barracks. She recently announced the creation of the Federal Indian Boarding School Truth Initiative to investigate policies that force children to assimilate. After Wednesday's ceremony, a caravan of Rosebud Sioux youth left the barracks with the children's remains and traveled to South Dakota. The caravan made several stops, including a prayer service stop in Sioux City, Iowa.
Remember me when the sun comes up in the morning sky, there I will be.
Most of the 9 children were reburied Saturday morning on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. For more, we're joined by one of the Rosebud Sioux Youth Council, who played a key role in all of this. Christopher Eaglebear, a member of the Sichangu Youth Council, joining us from Sichangu Oyate Nation in South Dakota. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Christopher. Thanks so much for being with us. Can you take us on the journey that you have gone on? This wasn't the first time you went to Carlisle, to bring the remains of your family and the ancestors of others at Rosebud Sioux Reservation.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, so when we first started, we were a youth council that was primarily just kids, you know. This was 6 years ago. A lot of us were still in high school or still in middle school. And so when we started, we went over there. For us, it was the first time, for a lot of us actually, it was the first time we were getting a good understanding of what a boarding school was, because boarding schools aren't really talked about growing up where I come from. You know, there's a traumatic event, something traumatic happened there that made you not want to talk about it, made you not want to recreate the pain or whatever it was. And your parents just wanted you to be protected from all of that horrificness. And so when we went to Carlisle, it was an eye-opener to who we are today as the Lakota people, you know. Everything that makes us who we are was kind of detached from us from these boarding schools. And so 6 years later, when we come back around, to come back again to bring back these kids, it was very, very eye-opening in the sense of the things we had to learn so that we can move forward. And what that was the knowledge of our spirituality, our way of life. And these schools, they played a key part in trying to sever that connection to who we are as Lakota. You know, they took away our language and they made it impossible for us to be who we really are. And so when the kids that did make it home, they came back with that traumatic experience and they didn't want to continue it forward for the next generations to come. And so I guess I want to say that as we moved forward, it all started with a single question that one of the members, a part of the youth group, said. And that was just a simple, why don't we bring them home? And that one question set off a big movement that 6 years later, we were able to, not only our tribe, but all the other tribes involved that were able to bring a child home, brought them home. And ours was just the first of, what I hope to come a big thing someday,
So you were there on Wednesday at the ceremony at Carlisle when the remains of the children were handed over. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland spoke there, and then this weekend she appeared on PBS NewsHour after attending that repatriation ceremony.
Secretary Haaland, you also wrote recently about the challenge of loving your own country, a country that was responsible for committing these acts. How do you explain that to others, to other Native Americans who look at this and question how can you love a country that has done this?
Well, first of all, my ancestral homelands are here, and I can't go anywhere else. This is my home, and this is where my family is. This is where my history is. We've been here for tens of thousands of years, and we want to make sure that we are defending this land for future generations. I believe very strongly in democracy, and if you look at tribes across the country, so many Indian tribes had long-standing historical democracies in their communities, and I am confident that our country can live up to its promise to people, to our citizens, and I want to be a part of that.
That's Interior Secretary Deb Haaland speaking to Judy Woodruff on PBS. Of course, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland is the first Native American cabinet member. This is Deb Haaland speaking last month.
For more than a century, the Interior Department was responsible for operating the Indian boarding schools across the United States and its territories. We are therefore uniquely positioned to assist in the effort to recover the dark history of these institutions that have haunted our families for too long. It's our responsibility. Today, I'm announcing and sharing with you all, first, that the department will launch the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. At no time in history have the records or documentation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools.
That's Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, before that Congress member from New Mexico, first Native cabinet member in U.S. history. Christopher Eaglebear, take us on that journey that you went Wednesday, the repatriation ceremony at Carlisle, and where you went from there with the remains of the children.
On Wednesday, at the Carlisle Industrial Military School, which it is now, we were given the right to hold a ceremony, and which was the transferring of the spirit ceremony. And when we first went there, we didn't expect it to be what it was. You know, we were really just thinking it was just going to be a little thing. And so it was a really big surprise to see Interior Secretary Haaland there, as well as all the other big officials that came along too. And so when we went on, it was actually very beautiful. Morning was very calm. It was very cool. And whenever the ceremony started, all the emotions came with it. There was this thickness in the room. You know, when you walked in there, you just wanted to, well, essentially, it felt like you just wanted to express an emotion that you cannot put into words. And so the ceremony itself, it took about 2 hours to commence so that we can do it properly in the way it's supposed to be done by our spiritual leaders, how they told us it should be. And so we were really fortunate to know that Secretary Deb Haaland came, because it just shows that, you know, as a Native American people, we still have an extension to one another, to where we still want to, if one's up here, we all want to be up here. And as a Native American, we know that when one of us rises, we all rise. And so it's really a good feeling to know that someone in her position is listening to what we're doing, you know, is paying attention to how we're moving forward with the Reparation Act, and hopefully as we move forward, there'll be other ceremonies with other tribes that move forward with their, bringing home their children.
And we will certainly follow them. And I want to thank you, Christopher Eaglebear, for joining us, a member of the Shichangu Youth Council, speaking to us from South Dakota. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Fels, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Noreen Sheikh, Maritar Sena, Tommy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamer Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Masuda, Joanna Contreras, our general manager, Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe.